If I had known that this show would still be relatively this unknown a few years down the line, I would have reviewed it a lot sooner. I wanted to review it sooner, but 90% of picking an Admirable animation is picking the right episode of a show to review. And you wait so long, and it stops airing new episodes. You need to pick the right episode to show off a show's strengths, where it seems to have gotten past all of its weaknesses. That's not the easiest thing to do. I mean, at the start, it's pretty simple. Just remove all the bad or mediocre episodes. Then, if possible, remove all the 2 arc-relevant episodes that outsiders will not get. That reason is why there have been so few anime Admirable animations, even though I really want to do more. And on top of that, you might want to remove episodes to talk about too touchy of a topic, unless that's what you're going for. But then there's a show like Dan vs., where most of the episodes are of a very good quality, but each episode has nothing overly specific to show off. You've almost got to pick an episode at random because the show is awesome, and each episode, with certain exceptions, is of similar quality. In that case, you can make it a counterpoint to something that you've already reviewed before. This is Dan vs. Canada. A while back, I reviewed the King of the Hill episode, Uh-Oh Canada, which basically existed to insult Canada and say all of their ways were inferior. It was bad. It wasn't really funny, at all. Hank's neighbors were so arrogant and jingoistic, it got to the point where things were largely uncomfortable. Contrast that with Dan vs. Canada, which is about an angry Dan trying to destroy the entire country of Canada. The first difference is that Dan is not really the good guy of the show. He's not exactly a villain either. If I had a character comparison, Dan is a lot like Ren Hoek from the original Ren and Stimpy. Quick to over-the-top anger, but not exactly what you'd call evil. Dan almost never strikes at random. He strikes against someone who has wronged him, whether or not that person, place, or abstract concept really has wronged him. And that's another thing. Dan doesn't discriminate. He pretty much hates everything. In this episode, he goes after Canada. In another episode, he goes after George Washington.
What are you doing here?
We are going to destroy George Washington.
The school or the monument?
The person.
He goes after New Mexico.
Let's see. New Mexico became a state on January 6, 1912, making it the 47th state in the Union.
Enough already! You're not helping me here. What are its weaknesses?
Weaknesses.
How do I hurt it?
This show is weird. And since Dan also goes after animal shelters, it is clear that he's not entirely the good guy. Although it is weird how often they give Dan the moral high ground considering he's Dan. The world seems to just want to hurt him sometimes. Certain plots have Dan getting revenge on a fancy restaurant because he can no longer get his favorite kind of sandwich. And it turns out the fancy restaurant is keeping chefs in a dungeon. One episode has Dan thinking that he's been stalked by a ninja. And it turns out he's really being stalked by a ninja. When Dan thinks that his dentist is scamming him, yep, his dentist is scamming him. The spoilers I just gave you don't really matter that much considering that this is largely a comedy show. It doesn't really give too much concern to the plot, and it lives and dies on its jokes. The show works a lot like Ed, Edd n Eddy. Normally in such a circumstance, you wouldn't want the main characters to win, but the world is just so batshit out to get them that you have no choice but to want to. So let's see what it's like when Dan goes after an entire country. This episode starts with...
Grab bags. What a scam. They lure you in with something you like. Something with an uplifting message.
Did I mention the show aired on the same channel as My Little Pony? Anyway, Dan finds that he's got a terrible Canadian comic book in a grab bag. He gets asked to save the Canadian geese.
The Canadian geese?
I don't even like American geese. One time, a goose bit me and stole my sandwich.
And then he gets stuck in Canadian maple syrup. Most episodes start like this with a bunch of random things tangentially related attacking Dan. Meanwhile, Dan's friend Chris is walking with his girlfriend Elise. Elise is another reason that I picked this episode specifically. Specifically, she's barely in it. Elise is a secret agent, and throughout the series, she tries to keep her secret identity hidden from Dan and Chris. And her subplots have a lot of espionage and super spy type stories. That sounds like a great and funny idea. However, how do I put this? Dan vs. the show is a lot like chocolate cheesecake, and Elise is a lot like gravy. It does not belong in this recipe. The worst episodes of Dan vs. give Elise extra spotlight and have her act as a deus ex machina to whatever shenanigans that Dan and Chris are up to. In the first and third seasons, her roles were definitely tolerable, but it's most the reason that people say the second season of Dan vs. is the worst of the three. She's not a bad character in the personality department though. She actually contributes a lot of funny jokes to the plot, and has a place in most of the stories, unless they get deep into the secret agent shit. And no, while Chris and Elise are married, their love life doesn't actually distract from the show, unless you're not exactly watching it for the comedy.
So clean you could eat off me.
I'm not going to do that.
I'm just saying you could.
Well, I'm not going to.
Fine!
So anyway, Dan wants to get revenge on the country of Canada for getting covered in syrup. This is so detached from reality and ridiculous that you can't help but find it funny. Whereas in King of the Hill, it tries to have its characters and stories as down to earth as possible. That's what gives that show its strength. But when King of the Hill gets cartoony and farcical, it leads to the absolute worst episodes of the show, like Lupe's Revenge, and the next King of the Hill episode that I'll be tackling, Hank's Choice, which felt like it would be more comfortable in an episode of The Simpsons or Family Guy. Also, you'll notice the animation is not the show's strong suit. That is kind of a problem, but it rarely hinders the show because the comedy is based more on dialogue and situation than flat-out slapstick humor. Working with your weaknesses, you know?
So, do we have a plan?
Of course. We go to Canada and make them pay for what they did to me.
At no point do they take this even close to seriously.
Here's what I know about Canada. England and France had a baby out of wedlock.
What Dan knows and doesn't know about the world has actually been stated in-universe as completely random. It's like he has a hobby of walking through Wikipedia every so often. Dan gives some frankly ridiculous description of Canadians, and Chris sets him straight in a more cartoony sense.
You could put a Canadian in a lineup with a bunch of normal people, and you wouldn't be able to tell.
It's revealed that Chris knows so much about Canada because he is 1/16th Canadian.
Don't?
Then you can get to Canada on your own.
I don't even know where Canada is!
It's north, you can't miss it.
Do you know that it is very hard for me to review a comedy show without just pointing to all the jokes and saying that they're really funny? It's a lot easier than the inverse anyway. I mean, for all 22 minutes, there's very rarely any time without any jokes being said.
Oh, well, good evening, eh? So now, what's the purpose of your visit here to Canada?
I wish to exact my vengeance upon this blight of a nation.
Oh, not today.
It's funny, not because he was trying to do something terrible, but because of how badly he failed to do something terrible. That describes a lot of the show, actually. So, they cut through the electric fence and continue to make their way through the Canadian wilderness.
What kind of a country is this? They still have all their trees. They're like baby teeth.
Let it be known that Dan is a very opinionated person. His plan is to find a massive glacier that could completely cover over Canada and doom it. And Chris gives a story about the weak spot in the glacier.
Hey, did I ever tell you about him?
No one wants to hear your boring story.
It was 100 years ago.
So when I say no one wants to hear your boring story, what do you hear?
More jerk characters should tell more stupid characters that when they do something stupid. It usually leads to a pretty good funny gag. Chris's great-great-grandfather came out of the woods after years of being thought of as dead. His wife remarried, and that makes him go crazy and tries to kill everyone with an axe. And this got his family to move to America, fleeing for their life. Dan also talks about how Canada is full of Yetis.
Maybe he ran across one. Maybe they became friends. Maybe he married one.
My great-great-grandfather was not a Yeti lover.
Whoa, is that even a thing?
It is a thing. A bad, shameful thing.
Okay, this show is weird. Also, this show, or at least this episode, has a bit of a thing for running gags. As Dan is about to eat a sandwich, he gets attacked by a gaggle of geese. Also, Chris catches a fish like a bear would. Moving on, after wandering through the wilderness for days, they come across an ice rink. While Chris keeps stalling them by ice skating, Dan melts the rink and steals a Zamboni. This stops 10 minutes later and forces them to walk, where they get to Quebec.
What? I hate Quebec. I hate it. I hate it! I hate it! I hate it!
Dan tends to hate random things. It's never really for no reason, but sometimes the reasons aren't stated. This leads them to a shady bunch of Quebec people that want to destroy all of Canada. Also, there's a hockey game on the melted ice rink.
Your ancestor wasn't crazy after all. Except for the,
Did I mention that this aired on the same channel as My Little Pony? Probably why it didn't take off too well or get very popular. This is why we should have very diverse television schedules, even if the shows are good. No 8-hour marathons of anything. As much as I like shows like Avatar or Samurai Jack, I wouldn't want endless marathons of them if it meant that other shows were getting cut short. Dan has, an interesting way of dealing with people.
this all about?
The Quebecois think they're French.
Oh, I see the problem here. Okay, you guys are here, and all the way over here is France. You're just confused geographically.
This gets them thrown out. However, Dan immediately knows where to go to get a map of the glacier. The Geological Society of Canada.
Society of Canada.
Where's that?
No idea.
Is there such a thing?
No idea.
Here we are in the third period. It's a riveting game, but the score is still tied at 0. And both teams still drowning.
I just love how they keep doing that in the background. Also, Dan tries to cover their tracks by burning down the building.
Fire is the cleanser.
Interesting piece of advice. Dan has quite a few of them, actually. Lets you know immediately the kind of guy that he is. This gets them caught and beat up and thrown in the hospital. So after Dan accuses Chris of sabotaging them, they have a fight and immediately make up. Kinda pointless, but okay. To finish up the plan, they take a rideable bear towards the glacier.
I'm bored.
Bored? We're riding a grizzly bear up a cliff.
Yeah, but we're missing so much good TV.
When they get to the glacier, they find Chris's long-dead murderous relative. They steal his axe and find the weak spot in the glacier. Then they get attacked by a yeti, and the show gets pretty weird. Chris turns into a bear for like 5 seconds, and then they find out that this yeti is related to Chris. And apparently that's why his family left Canada. And yeah, unlike most shows of this stature, Dan kinda usually wins. All of the time. Off the top of my head, he was able to win against the state of New Mexico. He won against George Washington, who had been dead for over 200 years. He even won against the concepts of technology and art. This is because most of the time, Dan has been wronged first in some way, shape, or form. He doesn't just attack at random. He has some sort of set of logic. Even if he is completely blowing these minor offenses completely out of proportion, it at least pushes him into the side of the protagonist. The show isn't really seeing Dan succeed though, but rather trying to. It is a weird show.